Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to focus on creating institutional change and cultivating change agents and leaders. I'm Erin Hamill, Senior Director of Professional Development at NARUC. This event is held in cooperation with the International Confederation of Energy Regulators Women in Energy Initiative and the U.S. National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. The contents are the responsibility of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of ICER or NARUC. Today, our speakers will share their experiences at the individual and organizational level on how to create change, increase credibility, and identify change agents to influence improvements in their own careers and within their institutions. Please note that there's a Q&A function, so feel free to ask any questions as they come up, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the presentations. As we consider how to identify and create an atmosphere to promote change, we can first consider our own power. Where do we fit within our organization? Where can we identify our ability to have influence at both the formal and informal power levels? When we are in our early career years, we might not yet have formal power, but we do have the ability to cultivate mentors and supporters to help us advocate for change. We also have the ability to identify characteristics of leaders that we might want to emulate and learn from to improve our own leadership styles and grow in our careers. These can often be seen not only in superiors, but also in colleagues that we work side by side with. As we listen to our speakers, I invite you to consider your own power footprint. What is currently, and what is your goal to expand it to in the future? I would also like to share two key charts that NARUC created under its USAID-funded Advancing Women in Leaders Energy Initiative. We hope that you can use these going forward at both the individual level as you advance your career and at the institutional level as you become champions for change within your organizations. Step one is identification of an issue or an opportunity. What is it that you'd like to change? A policy, an informal practice? What is your rationale for change? How would this benefit your organization? Who are the people that need to be supportive of in order for this change to happen? And finally, what is a realistic timetable for your proposed change? This, of course, is based on the magnitude of change and can be easy or difficult depending on that level of change. Step two is to set short-term and long-term goals around this change. This chart helps you translate what you have identified through step one into more concrete goals and actions. With thoughtful consideration of potential barriers, financial or time resources that your organization will need to give in order to be supportive, and finally, the measurement of what success will look like. Just a note about other resources available to you. We invite all women and men who work for U.S. and international energy regulators to join ICER's Women in Energy Initiative. There are opportunities for peer coaching, thematic circles of excellence, and we do gender data surveys and webinars such as these. So please feel free to join via the LinkedIn connection or through the website. We are pleased to welcome two distinguished leaders for today's webinar. Commissioner Abigail Anthony has been with the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission since 2017, and prior to that built her career focusing on grid modernization and energy efficiency, working both within industry and state government. Our second speaker, Commissioner Ann Rendahl, has been with the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission since 2014 and currently serves as NARUC's first vice president. Ann is an active leader within NARUC, serving as chair and member of various committees. She's also engaged in several advisory councils. Prior to her appointment as a commissioner, she led UTC's Policy and Legislative Affairs section and served as an administrative law judge. With that, we're very excited to turn it over to our two speakers, and we're going to go ahead and start with Commissioner Anthony. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Again, my name is Abigail Anthony. I serve on the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission, and I want to start by thanking Erin and all of NARUC for inviting me to be a part of the seminar this morning. In all of my engagements with the Advancing Women Leaders in Energy program, I've learned so much, and I expect to do the same today. So Erica, could you please go to the next slide? So Erin asked me to talk about assertiveness this morning, and I wanted to start by offering you my definition of assertiveness, which is the ability to be clear, direct, and free from blame or negativity. Assertiveness is not about being loud or dominating a conversation, but it is about being clear, truthful, and well-reasoned. An assertive statement is firm and truthful, but it's not unkind. When you're free from judgment or blame, it makes other people better able to hear you and receive your message. So I think it's helpful to contrast assertiveness with other communication styles that we often see when we go about our days. So in the lower corner, you see sincere. A sincere communicator is someone who's well-meaning, but they may be misinformed. While they speak from sincerity or eagerness, they also lack insight or information. Going up to that top corner, I labeled that the cunning communicator. The cunning communicator knows the truth, but is deliberately obscuring, deflecting, or distorting it. And then below that is the unreliable communicator. An unreliable communicator deals on the basis of rumor, emotion, or ignorance. They may not be able to, or they may not care to be able to determine credible information from bad information, and either a carelessness or even a willful carelessness prevents productive exchange with that person. But the key point that I wanted to offer with with these definitions and this contrasting different communication styles, is that assertiveness is not a personality trait. You aren't born assertive or unassertive. It's a skill, and it's a skill that you can learn, and you can use it to bring clarity to vague or tense situations, or to surface issues respectfully, and use it in a situation to bring forward momentum into decision making. So, Erin, if you could just move next. So I have found that one of the best ways to prepare to be assertive is to have a structured approach to making decisions or forming conclusions. And really, one of the best ways to be assertive is to prepare to be assertive. At the Public Utilities Commission, my team and I often use a three-part framework when we're doing our work, when we're evaluating utility investment proposals. We use this framework nearly every day, all the time, and so it's become very easy. We look at need, value, and accountability. Is there a known operational or legal need for the investment? Value. Will ratepayers receive net benefits from the investment? And accountability. If the investment doesn't deliver, are there consequences for the utility? Then I rely on the evidence in the record to answer each of these questions. And as the evidence lines up, it becomes clear whether the case for need or value is strong or weak. For example, if something is needed, it has inherent value. If it's not needed but has clear benefits, I think about whether there's an appetite for discretionary investments. If it's neither needed nor beneficial, why would we do it? The point of this example is just to say having a decision-making framework based on knowledge is a core foundation for being assertive, because it helps me to reach clarity before I start communicating with my colleagues. It provides a shared structure and a language for discussions, and it allows me to explain and show people how I arrive at my decisions. And I found that making decisions and drawing conclusions based on evidence and being transparent about how you do that are sort of shortcuts to having credibility. This process also helps me understand what I care about. Sometimes I care about a principle, and one of my other decision-making colleagues cares about a number or a particular answer. We can often vote the same way for different reasons, but because I've gone through this whole process and I understand what I'm trying to do, I'm better able to actually negotiate and get to the place where I want to be. The key point here is that preparation matters. And being assertive requires that you've thought carefully about the basis for your decision or your conclusion, and that you have evidence and information to support it. Then, sort of in the moment when you're engaging with other people and you're in discussions, I found that the best way to stay calm is to listen and ask questions to understand other people's reasoning and other people's decision-making framework. How did they arrive at their conclusions? And can my framework be updated with better evidence if they're presenting it? I also find that listening gives you the chance to reflect on what you're hearing and decide whether to update your thinking and know where you're flexible. Erica, yeah, thank you. So you don't always need to be assertive, but assertiveness is most effective when you want to ensure clarity or share knowledge and you know you have good information. But assertiveness isn't always necessary or the best way to communicate. So you don't want to be assertive if you're operating in a low information environment. In those cases, you probably want to be asking questions. When you're brainstorming with friends or colleagues, that's a time to be open and curious. You know, if the moment is personal and it involves grief or vulnerability, that's a time just to be present. Conflict often benefits more from asking questions than making assertions. And there really may be times when you want to obscure the truth, you know, like when you're talking to your kid about Santa. That's actually probably a time when that cunning corner is where you want to be. There may also be times when you can get your way without revealing all of your knowledge. If you're negotiating and you understand that the other person can get to your desired outcome without relying on all of your evidence, it might benefit you just to stop talking. We often refer to that as letting the other guy have it your way. Erica, can you move forward? But assertiveness, I think, and I don't know this for sure, but I really think that assertiveness, actually, can you go forward one more? There you go. Thanks. I think that assertiveness is always helpful in conversation. There's certainly maybe times when it's not, but I want to talk about a few situations where you're interacting with other people and how being assertive changes the nature of the conversation. I think that assertiveness can be a very stabilizing force. So, you know, I think that the best, one of the best working environments is when two assertive people are together. In that case, they're both interested in growing, learning, and gaining a better understanding of how things work. When two people are both being assertive, they're open to evidence and to updating their understanding or their conclusions based on better ideas. These conversations and these partnerships really build toward truth and mutual growth. You know when you're in that moment and you're working with somebody, you're both growing and you're having a great time. Erica, can you move to the next slide? Um, Here's a conversation where one person is being assertive and the other is sincere. And sincere was that category that I described as earnest, but maybe has misinformation or lacks knowledge. In this case, when somebody is well-meaning, but they're wrong, the assertive person has the opportunity to teach and provide a fuller understanding. It's an opportunity for trust and mutual respect to grow. And often when someone is being assertive, they're trying to communicate something that they have clarity on, and other people may not have that same clarity. And so the role of the assertive person is really to help other people gain clarity and better information. This can also be a really positive experience. Erica, could you move forward? Now we're going up into more difficult conversations. When somebody is being cunning and they're deliberately avoiding the truth, their goal is not clarity. Their goal is maybe control or deflection or delay. This person may attack your transparency behind your back, and to your face, they might make you question what you know. You might leave that conversation feeling kind of, I don't know, crazy. the other thing is when you're in this corner, once the cunning person has decided to make a move or take a position, they kind of have to marry it. They have to stick with it. They can't walk away from that position. They're not trying to advance understanding, but the assertive communicator can expose contradictions and bad faith. But it's a struggle because the assertive person is dealing in facts, and the cunning person is often dealing in optics. And finally, Erica, when someone is unreliable, this can get really chaotic. If you're feel like if you have a sense that you are in discussion with somebody who is unreliable and the communication that you're having needs to be relied on, this is a time when you probably want to get things in writing. You might believe that you've agreed to something or resolved an issue, and you don't want to find out the hard way that they aren't even on the same on the same plane. So those conversations can be really chaotic. So assertiveness is a tool to confront dishonesty, and I sort of went through that in maybe the issue with the cunning communicator, or even the unreliable communicator. And I want to talk about two types of dishonesty that you might face: bias and motivated resistance. Someone may be predisposed to dismiss you because of your gender, age, your race, your tone, and other people may need to ignore you because not because you're unclear or you're not being assertive, but because listening to you would make their jobs harder or threaten their status or expose, inconvenient truths. And in these cases, you may need to expand your strategy by bringing other people in as witnesses. Assertiveness can expose the other person's dishonesty to sort of the audience, to others. And when someone won't hear you because of who you are, your assertiveness may not reach them. But by relying on your knowledge, you can still reach everyone else who's listening and, build allies. Prejudice and bias really thrive in ambiguity and behind closed doors. And assertiveness, especially when witnessed by others, limits the space to hide. So I want to leave you, in conclusion, the presence of an assertive person can often change the whole room. Assertiveness is not about controlling others or dominating the conversation. Assertiveness is about being calm, clear, and grounded in evidence. Assertiveness can expose manipulation and dishonesty and make it easier for others to speak, understand, and make decisions. An assertive person sets a productive, inclusive, and patient tone and really shows what leadership is all about. And with that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Rendahl.
Okay, it helps to come on mute. Thank you, Commissioner Anthony. That was really well done. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity for being here today. And thank you to ICER and to NARUC and Women in Energy event. This is a great series of conversations. And so I'm going to be focusing this morning on the topic of how institutions or organizations may unintentionally contribute to a culture of reinforcing gender roles and how that might show up in the workplace, how it might result in discriminatory practices. I'm going to follow that discussion with a focus on how women and men in regulation can help make changes in the workplace within their areas of influence and jurisdiction. So each of these topics are the subject of numerous articles and books and could be the subject of discussion that could last for more than one day. So this morning, we're going to talk about this topic at a very high level. And could you go to the next slide, please, Erica? So we need to start this topic by recognizing that each institution or organization has its own culture. Organizational culture represents the rules, values, beliefs, and philosophy that guide workplace behavior. This culture will impact how employees are expected to interact with one another, the hierarchy of the organization, how leadership is expected to act, as well as the process for how work gets done. There may be a different culture in different sections of an organization as well. Organizational culture develops over time, but in many organizations, it reflects longstanding or historical rules, processes, and expectations. In other words, this is how we've always done it, regardless of whether it's more efficient or whether all members of the organization feel included or respected. Organizational culture can also include overt or implied gender roles, and without consciously thinking about it, may result in unconscious gender bias in organizations. Gender stereotypes can be reflected in this culture, creating gender dynamics in the workplace. For example, stereotypes about women include that they are emotional and focus on compassion, which might cloud their ability to make difficult decisions. Women are or should be deferential and conciliatory. Women are not or should not speak out or be aggressive, and if they do, they're bullies. Women are physically weaker and should not perform physical work. Women value relationships and are collaborative, and due to their roles as wives and mothers, women should have other responsibilities that mean they should not work, or if they do, that these roles may make it hard or impossible for them to work. Men, on the other hand, are stereotyped as assertive, direct, competitive, and good at technical and quantitative matters. Men are seen as natural leaders, confident and direct. Men are the breadwinners and expected to work. Men are physically stronger and are well suited for active physical jobs. Men are not responsible for children or matters related to housework. And if men do take on responsibilities for children or show emotion or compassion, they may be seen as weak. We all know that as individuals, men and women express themselves differently, have different strengths, and may or may not show up or fit within these stereotypes. But these stereotypes do show up in the workplace. If you could go to the next slide, please. So how do stereotypes or unconscious bias show up in the workplace? There may be careers that are seen as men's or women's roles. In education, women are traditionally teachers at preschool, as well as at the pre-university or kindergarten through 12th grade level, while men may be professors or principals. Men are more likely to be in fields of computer science and engineering. In the medical field, women are more likely to be nurses and men doctors. Men are more likely than women to be in construction or field engineering work. And in the office, this can show up as women serving in secretarial or assistance roles, including those as note takers, recorders, organizers or schedulers, researchers, and doing work in a supportive role. Women are not expected to speak up with ideas and may not even be expected to be at the table during discussions or when decisions are made. Men may be seen as leaders, speakers, responsible for taking action or initiative, and in decision-based roles. They're expected to express opinions and participate in discussions. So think about how this occurs or has occurred in your organization. And I'm not saying that this happens to everyone or in every organization, but it can show up this way. Are there organizations in which you have worked where the culture reinforces gender roles? How has or does this show up in your organization? Who or what in the organization reinforces a culture that reflects gender roles? As I said, well, this is less prevalent now than when I started my career 40 years ago. I have seen this as women being typists and assistants, and fewer women in leadership roles, and fewer promotional opportunities, and women having to work harder to demonstrate their skills and abilities. 60 years ago, my own mother, who after having her first child was expected to stay at home, and if she returned to her job teaching the salesman at IBM how to program and use mainframe computers, would be demoted to an entry-level position. Further, no childcare was available, and she didn't have many options. When I had my children, almost 30 years ago, parental leave was an option, as was the ability to return to my position. The culture in my organization supported women and men who became parents. However, my experience is not universal, and not all organizations are like that. We'll have some polling questions that will allow you to respond to these thoughts. Erica, if you could go to the next slide, please. So gender bias can show up in organizations. I don't think we're ready for the poll yet. If you could go back to the prior slide. Erica. Okay, so gender bias can show up in organizations as actionable discrimination. In general, discrimination is treating one person differently than another in a way that violates legal requirements. Most HR departments and organizations are able to address overt discrimination in hiring and promotions, but some forms of discrimination are more subtle and less visible. The more overt forms of discrimination include direct statements that impact an employee's work opportunities from supervisors or leaders. Open discrimination can also include direct questions in hiring interviews about marital status or whether you have or plan to have children, and if you have children, your responsibilities for childcare. The more subtle forms of bias and discrimination can occur through dress codes that require women to wear dresses, skirts, and nylons and heels, different compensation for men and women in the same position or length of employment when data about compensation status is not made publicly available, unspoken or implied expectations for roles and positions not in a job description that are based on gender, such as making coffee, taking notes at meetings, and making copies. It can also include position or job descriptions based on technical skills or past work experience rather than abilities and skills. And the tendency to hire or promote people who are similar to or have similar backgrounds, education, or experiences as those in leadership or on the interview panel. This is referred to as affinity bias. So if you could go to the next slide, now we can start with our poll, our first poll. And could the NARUC team please run the polls? So this first poll is, what are the primary situations in which you've experienced an organization reinforcing gender roles or engaging in discrimination? And there's a number of opportunities. If you've experienced other situations, if you could identify them in the chat and we can talk about them later. So I don't know do we have the results of this poll? Okay, so it looks like there's experience with these types of gender roles across the board and possibly other situations as well. If you can move on to the next poll. This second polling question asks whether you've experienced a difference in bias or discrimination in the private sector or government organizations. And this is based purely on your experience and may or may not, there may or may not be a difference because every organization is different and every organizational culture is different depending on the organization. So I'm seeing a response that maternity leave was cut without notice when I informed them I was expecting. Yes, and who's listened to or trusted in meetings and discussions? Thank you for those. And any response to this poll? Okay, so almost a little more leaning to the private sector and less in public, but still. I think the question, somebody says, I think the question is, how do you know if you've experienced gender discrimination, hiring, promotion, and salary? Exactly. If the information is not available, it's not always easy to know unless you are talking to other people in the organization. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, we'll move on to the issue of organizational change. And similar to the discussion of gender bias and discrimination, this topic could be the subject of a multi-day conference, is the subject of a multitude of books and articles and classes in business schools and public administration programs. Essentially, change management in terms of organizational change will focus on the organization's processes as well as the people in the organization. We can focus on process change in an organization through methods like Lean, Six Sigma, or other ways to look at how an organization is currently taking action, making a product, evaluating requests or applications, or making a decision in order to make a process more efficient. Cultural change in an organization is looking at the way the organization demonstrates its values, mission, and beliefs, how team members experience these cultural elements, and whether they trust supervisors and leaders. Underlying all changes in an organization, however well-intentioned or necessary, are the people involved in the process. Most people are resistant to change, and depending on how the change is presented and managed, will either perceive the change as a risk or a benefit. If team members perceive the proposed change as something they can understand, support, and implement, there'll be a sense of comfort and security. For those team members that do not have comfort and security, they'll likely experience feelings of anxiety and worry, which can show up in the office as productivity loss, employee dissatisfaction, distrust of leadership or a process, and passive resistance, in other words, continuing to do things the old way, all of which are going to slow the proposed change and require more attention and focus. At the end of the spectrum of response to change, team members might feel threatened, triggering a sense of personal risk and flight from the organization, and this can show up as a high turnover rate, active resistance to the change or objections, opting out of the change or silent quitting, as well as tangible customer impact. Customers can feel the dissatisfaction of the employees. So how a leader or an organization presents and implements change can have an impact on how the people and team members experience and respond to the proposed change. If you could go to the next slide, please. So on this slide, I'm showing graphically how people respond to change. While it's simplistic, it shows that depending on the impact of the change and how large that change is in an organization, the risks increase, as does the resistance of team members. For example, and this is an example many of you might have experienced, most organizations experience changes in software updates, which when communicated effectively, create little disruption. However, when changing or redesigning an entire software system that team members use for their daily work, this can be disruptive and requires a process for consulting team members. This is much like what Erin discussed at the beginning, having a plan and a process. And that process ensures changes reflect employees' needs and involves testing and working out the bugs or issues before the new system goes live. Significant changes to organizational culture are like software system changes. They can be disruptive and they can provide benefits to team members, but they need to be managed to avoid significant risks. Essentially, team members appreciate being consulted, discussing impacts to ensure they might benefit, and feeling valued in the process. This is going to take longer, but it can result in successful implementation. No one likes a change just being sprung on them, whether in our personal lives or at work. Leaders should consider a similar effort in making organizational or cultural change, evaluating the state of the organization and how team members perceive the organization is a good start. Consulting with trusted leaders and supervisors who can serve as allies in the change can also help. After consultation with the leadership and supervisory level, engaging with key trusted staff to test the proposal can also ensure you have change agents at the team level. Without support from key allies at various levels of the organization, no change is likely successful. It will simply be another new idea from the top. And similarly, if there's resistance, assessing why the resistance is occurring can help determine whether a change in approach is necessary. If you could go to the next slide, please, Erica. So think about any significant organizational changes you have either initiated or been involved in, and whether these efforts were successful or not, and why. What are the leadership skills that are most effective in changing workplace culture? Transparency, trust, team building? What are the traits and qualities of a good change agent? Again, transparency, being direct, being clear. What strategies were most effective for you in creating institutional change, in particular change in workplace culture? Who did you rely on most to support your efforts? Who are your change agents? Who's in your sphere of influence? Are there other leaders or supervisors you can work with? And how important is the existing institutional process for success, or does it create barriers to success? As you think about these questions, I'll highlight some of the actions you can take for greater success. Depending on the change you're proposing, the extent of your effort will likely vary, and this is exactly what Erin was speaking to at the beginning. So those resources that NARUC has worked together with Women in Energy and ICER will be very helpful. First, you should assess the culture and level of trust in the organization. It will tell you the appetite for the proposed change, as well as a sense of where you might have resistance, and you might need to begin the process of change at a different level than you originally thought. Build a coalition. This means having conversations with others in the organization in order to identify and develop those team members who can support and sponsor your proposal. These team members can also assist when there is resistance. However, don't just surround yourself with those who agree with you. You're going to miss valuable information. Make sure you don't mistake constructive suggestions or criticism for resistance or retaliate against those who express hesitancy or concern. It will only build more resistance. Listen carefully to concerns, as those expressing concerns may be the ones who are brave enough to say so, and there are likely several others who feel the same but will not say anything. You should maintain consistent and frequent communication. Once you begin discussing the proposed change, ensure consistent messaging across the organization and over time. Explain the proposal, the why, and the benefit to the organization and team members. If there is a valid reason to change course or modify a process after you've heard some concerns, highlight this and address it, explain why, because transparency may help to address further resistance. Keep the focus on the proposed change and the reasons why it's necessary and how it benefits team members. Ensure change agents use the same message, because they might be telling their teams, this is because leadership says we have to do so, and that's undermining the organizational intent here. Remain active and visible in managing the change. Once you've initiated the proposed change, make sure you're leading the change, modeling the change, and holding yourself accountable. Be clear about the reasons and benefits of the change, attend meetings with team members, and stay accessible, and ensure team members are also accountable. So now we have the last polling question. So if NARUC staff, if Erica, you could pull that up. And this poll is talking about what you might do and how you might approach organizational change first. When you're working to change an institutional culture, what do you do first? And there's a number of options here. You might have other options, other things you would do first, and please feel free to share that in the chat if you have different options. So is there a result yet for the poll? Okay, and the number one choice is identify the problem and why it's necessary, because that's going to help you to really understand where you need to start and who you need to work with and what you need to focus on, and also evaluating your current culture. So yes, I would agree, those are where to start. Okay, so thank you for your thoughts and your comments in the chat. And different leaders will take different approaches to initiating and affecting change in an organization. How you go about affecting change, who you consult, and who you rely on as your change agents and allies, and the process by which you pursue the change can result in success and progress, or distrust and resistance. So thank you all. I hope this has been helpful. And back to you, Erin.
Great. Thank you both. I think this was very helpful. It made me consider a number of items that we have identified over the last few years in working with our Women in Leader Change, our HR working group, I should say. And I think one of the things we notice is to often start with the easier opportunities. And so I've said this in other audiences before, but frankly, I think one of the benefits that COVID led to was the ability for organizations to review their telework policies and their flexibility on the core hours worked. And I know that in a number of countries that we have worked in, they're able to demonstrate just through the fact that once people were working from home during the height of COVID, they were still doing their jobs, and that they were able to also do their jobs with a little bit more flexibility. It didn't have to be the traditional 9 to 5. And so, in my view, that became one of those easier or low-hanging fruit opportunities to pursue institutional change, because it was almost retroactive, in that you're updating your policy to keep up with where the organization had gone as a result of the pandemic. We've also seen little things as well. We worked with a number of countries on their recruitment and job advertisement processes. For example, neutralizing the language. We saw where there was this kind of cultural, social construct that more women would feel that they needed to have the experience every single item that was listed in the job description. And then men would feel like, oh, I've got 2 out of 10, so good enough, I can apply for this position. So we worked with a number of countries to adjust the language and tones and word choices that they use in their job ads to be more open, to be more inclusive, and to maybe highlight that you don't need all of these skill sets. You can just have some of them and still be qualified to apply. I wanted to go back to Commissioner Anthony and ask a quick question. We've got a number of questions in the chat that we'll get to as well. But I think, you talked about your 3-point framework for utility investments, and how having a decision-making framework really helped to have that basis of knowledge and lead to the credibility and preparation. And so I'm wondering if you have an example, maybe at a more individual or career level, of how people can use that framework, or any framework, frankly, and build up their knowledge and their credibility and preparation so that they can take on that assertive position, so that it's based on those facts rather than just based on a very strong opinion, for example. So I wanted to know if you had of a more individual career-oriented example you might share.
I'm sure that there is, although I would offer that I think maybe it's easier to practice being assertive when you're um, doing things in an environment where it's not necessarily so personal, right? If you're trying to develop the practice of being assertive, I would urge people to practice it in an environment that's not emotionally fraught or loaded, in a place where you do have access to knowledge, and where you're not sort of where it's less ambiguous, because that, it's easier to start that way than it is, say, when you're trying to be assertive with a friend or a spouse or a parent or something, where things are more fraught. But I would say I often sit in board meetings that and I'm sure that this is a fairly common experience, where they get off agenda. People are sort of spiraling around issues where the conversation lacks direction, it lacks forward momentum, um, and you just go on and on forever, and everybody's getting agitated and frustrated with each other. And I have noticed when somebody can enter that conversation very calmly and just say, here is, like, let's just take a step back. Here is where we started. This is what we know. This is what we're trying to do. And here are some options for moving forward. Like, everybody in the group just takes a deep breath and is like, oh, thank God somebody stepped in with a framework for how we can move this conversation forward. And so I think I actually practiced this myself the other day when thinking through this issue of assertiveness. Um, and I was engaged in a conversation about two employees who seemed to not get along with each other. and what was to be done about the two employees who seemed not to get along with each other. And the conversation was just going around and around about like why they couldn't get along or why they might not get along. And I made some notes on my paper and just, noted like it's not important really why they aren't getting along. What's important is how we can support them so that they can do their jobs the best way. And then was able to sort of enter this very emotionally fraught conversation calmly with sort of a fact-based and action-based approach rather than, sort of continuing to spiral around speculation.
Great, thank you. And Commissioner Rendahl, building on your comments, we actually have several thoughts in the chat related to how can you help reduce the stereotyping, right? And these can be related to women being the traditional note taker or the person who stays behind to clean up the conference room. And so I'd welcome your thoughts on what you can do and at all levels of the career, right? Maybe you're younger in your career. What do you feel like you can do? Maybe you're more seasoned in your career. How can you intervene in an appropriate way?
So thank you for that. And it's funny, I was just reading something online yesterday, someone talking about how their grandmother set a good role model for them as not to sort of accept these are the roles that you should be put in and to ask questions and to raise the issue. And I think doing so, as Commissioner Anthony said, being assertive, finding your soft power, aggressive doesn't have to be angry or yelling or creating controversy. It can be simply raising the issue. So I think it's harder for those who are at the beginning of their career than those who have found their place and are more comfortable and maybe have a position of power. But I think it's appropriate to raise your concerns about if certain employees are consistently being asked to provide the support role, even though they're on par with others. So if you have team members of both genders and some are being expected to do some things that are more in a support role than others, then I think identifying this to the team leader without being confrontational, but just stating the facts as, in this assertive way. I like this assertiveness model that you've brought forward, Commissioner Anthony, and stating the facts and expressing a need for having an opportunity to share these responsibilities and not assume that they should be taken care of by women. Now, it'll depend on your supervisor or your leader and whether they have this is unconscious, it's just happened that way, and they're not thinking about what this looks like or comes out as. And then being more aware in meetings, I saw some of the comments in the chat of when women say something, it's not really picked up, but then a man will repeat it and everybody sort of circles around that idea and like, yeah, that's a great idea. And so it's really talking with folks after the meeting and saying, hey, I don't know if you remember, but I did raise this issue. And then as soon as, this other person picked it up and talked about it, why did that make that a better idea than when I first, brought it up? And maybe talking to the person who took that idea and ran with it and saying, you could have just recognized that I had made a good point and supported it, and recognizing and identifying everyone's responsibilities. It could be a newer employee, it could be a younger male employee who makes a point, an older male employee who picks it up, but recognizing the people who are there and their contributions. And so I think there's some combination of asserting yourself in a positive way and not just assuming that you shouldn't say anything. Ask questions, bring things up in a positive, assertive way, and I think that can make a difference.
I think that's interesting. And I invite Commissioner Anthony, if you'd like to chime in as well. I recall early in my career, I worked with someone, and whenever I would make a suggestion, the answer would be almost always no. But then I realized, I think, how to use my soft power more advantageously in describing, what the benefits would be and why this was, a good idea. And so eventually it came around that then the person would raise it. I would joke that, oh, it would be his idea 6 months later, right? And, you know, it was frustrating in one sense, but it was also at least the idea was now there and being pursued, right? So in the end, it was a win. But the, credit, it was challenging that, we had to kind of go through this dance to be able to give the information. But it also, I think, helped me learn how to give the information in a way that would be beneficial. But it's very interesting that there were several statements about this issue of I raise an idea and then, a man takes it over, and that's when there is support for it. So welcome any other thoughts on that as well. Um, we also have questions about kind of pay equity, and definitely we're seeing differences in the public versus private sectors. So welcome your thoughts on how to deal with some of these challenges, maybe where the public sector maybe perhaps just has more, rules or more equal access to information. So there's not quite as many challenges as we see in the private sector.
Right, and I think you just stated the reality, which is in the public sector, there are far more rules and requirements, um, you know, around personnel issues. And so many of these things are addressed, and some states even require that salaries and salary levels are posted publicly. That information is publicly available, so people can actually see what others are making and see if there is some pay equity or compensation issues. And that is not always the case in the private sector. And so, but it does not mean, based on the response to the poll, it doesn't mean that these biases don't exist in the public sector. And there's still things that we all need to work on. And it's not just gender bias, there's other biases in all workplaces. And so there is room for more work from all of us. And I think it's just once you begin having these conversations in your organization where there's issues that come up, then you begin to address them more. And so I see there's a comment, and I appreciate the comment that even with rules in the public sector, there are still issues, which is absolutely true. And the bias may be less overt, and there's still issues with salaries for women compared to men. So I don't know if folks have any questions they want to put in the Q&A. We can answer your questions. Appreciate the conversation in the chat.
I'd also go back to one of the early comments in the chat, which was who is listened to and trusted in meetings and discussions, right? And so I think there's the twofold side. Who do you listen to and trust and why? And then secondary, building upon that, how can you become the person that is listened to and trusted? So welcome your thoughts on those issues.
I would just I feel like I think about this a lot, and I would offer that I'm sure we've all had the experience of knowing people who gain some level of attention, I'll say, or maybe they're listened to. They command attention just because they take up space. They end up in positions of leadership not because they demonstrate true leadership or true credibility, but because they are often there may be those cunning people are like they have a lot of bluster, um, or they have high levels of I don't know, like verbal acumen, but like they take up space. But what we really always want to keep an eye out are for the people who demonstrate or earn true credibility. And they earn that credibility by having knowledge, um, using that knowledge to come to conclusions in a transparent way, um, by teaching others and, empowering, encouraging everyone to like elevate, to grow better by sharing their knowledge in a way that is, generous. And I think as a society, I'd love to see that we all work towards raising up our true leaders and people who are truly credible because they have understanding and and are assertive and, sidelining those who are just sort of bringing a lot of, I don't know, hot air.
And Commissioner Anthony, I appreciate that because there are times over the years when women in the organization I'm in come to me and sort of ask, how do you, move forward? How do you gain this experience, and how do you promote yourself in an organization? And one of the things I tell them is that women, especially starting out earlier in their career, they won't speak up if they have an idea. They won't share their views because usually there's somebody else in the room, as you mentioned, who is always saying something. And because they're always saying something, people turn to them and sort of expect them to have the answers. And women tend to have this sense of less confidence. Not everyone, this is an overgeneralization, but I think you have to practice exerting your own confidence, overcoming that assumption that you shouldn't say something. Just assume confidence, because I watch young men and young women, and the men just say things, even if they don't really have a response based on facts or knowledge. They will just make a statement and it will be assumed as fact. Whereas women tend to need to really know and have that knowledge and the facts before they're willing to speak up and say something. So I think you have to do a little bit of that assertive statement, even if you may not have everything lined up perfectly behind you. Sometimes you have to exert that confidence, even though internally you may be saying, I have no idea what I'm doing here.
I think that loops back to what Abigail was saying, that assertiveness is a learned skill and not a personality characteristic. And I think that's a really profound statement that all of us can take and consider, because regardless of where we are in our careers, we're going to have those different levels of influence, but we could also have different levels of support that we can be giving out to our colleagues within our organizations, as well as to our colleagues in the broader stakeholder community. And so where we can practice that assertiveness and provide positive, supportive feedback to other individuals in their organizations, and then the community help them with their growth, I think is a really valuable lesson for all of us to learn. And then I would note, as we're wrapping up, that we have a number of webinars previously recorded related to these topics, related to mentoring, related to career growth, building your circles of influence and your support network. So we will have a link to those past webinars, and we encourage you to share them with your colleagues, as well as review them if you were not able to join and watch them previously. And I would like to give a huge thank you to Commissioner Anthony and First Vice President Rendahl for contributing to today's webinar and sharing your thoughts and your experiences, and giving us all an opportunity to learn from you and to grow from the descriptions that you've given of how to build our assertiveness, how to build our influence. So thank you very much, and we appreciate your time and contributions. Thank
Thank
you
you for
all.
hosting the conversation, Erin.
Yes, thank you very much. Have a great day all.
Bye-bye.